and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books surrounding you here are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
Well, we're back with the witch episode this time. I did a little survey on our Facebook group, and as I suspected, witches are a requested topic. In particular, I had a couple people ask recently about granny witches, which this episode kind of aligns with.
And it's sort of a topic near and dear to you, too, as you were telling me.
There's a German element that overlaps with my Krampus interest, if that's what you mean, yes.
No, your family.
Well, yes, the Ridenours were Pennsylvania Germans. My ancestors originally lived in Bucks County after coming through Philadelphia, but I don't know that they were witches.
But still, enough to inspire 2 episodes on the topic.
We will be doing a second episode on all this because there's a lot of good material, but I wouldn't paint it as some sort of a personal ancestry celebration.
But listeners are interested in our personal stories, you know. I certainly see that with my pen pals.
Yes, your pen pals.
It would be nice to have more interactions, or maybe some discussion based on what's in the current episode. Like that book you mentioned in the script, The Long Lost Friend. I think everyone has a long lost friend they wonder about from time to time.
Oh, that's completely unrelated to the book.
Still, just as a conversation starter, maybe if we were to talk about it. A long lost friend, not the book, which I know is different and you're saving for the actual show, but an actual friend that was lost and then reappeared.
I don't really like how this is going, and why should the friend have to reappear? That's not part of being lost.
I'm sure everyone out there can think of an example, especially if we prime the pump with stories of our own.
I feel like you want to talk about a long lost friend. I don't, and I think this is really going off the rails, but why don't you talk about your long lost friend?
Well, now you're putting me on the spot. I don't really have one. I didn't expect to, but now I feel embarrassed. You know my childhood. It's not like I had friends come and go. Mother, the only thing I thought of when I heard that phrase was terrible. It was a doll Mother made me. She was always at my side, day and night. And then one day, she disappeared. Mrs. B.
Of course, Mrs. B. It's always bees and hives.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. No, just the letter B. She had a letter B sewn on her. One day, when I was playing outside and she got dirty, and Mother was doing laundry when I came in, I didn't know any better. So I dropped her in the washer to get clean, and she just disappeared after that. I told Mother what happened, and she said she probably went down the drain, but one day, maybe a year later, I found Mrs. B. Mother had hidden her because it's like she disintegrated. And her eyes, her little button eyes, she had no eyes. I don't even want to talk about it.
Well, you see, sometimes it's better if they don't come back. It's kind of like the monkey's paw.
Sure, make jokes. You probably never had a lost friend, a long lost friend.
The child I used to play with was kidnapped, but they did find his shoes.
Oh.
And pants.
I'm sorry.
Anyway, episode 60, Witches, Healers, and Hexcats of Old Pennsylvania. I am your host, Al Ridenour, and this show, Bone and Sickle, examines the intertwining of horror and folklore in a historical context. I started this show as a way to further explore this area of intersection after writing my book, The Krampus and the Old Dark Christmas. Bone and Sickle only exists thanks to the generosity of our Patreon donors who receive monthly rewards, including short bonus episodes. I'll have more on the world of our Patreon supporters at the end of our show.
Merrily dance we, merrily dance we, round and round this old oak tree. Full many will dance this terrible night, but none will be merry but we.
Our sisters are out, on mischief bent, the cows their milk shall fail. The old maid's cat shall be rode to death, and her lapdog lose his tail.
In 1860, Matthew Schropp Henry included these words supposedly chanted by witches in his volume, History of the Lehigh Valley, that would be in eastern Pennsylvania. He sets the stage for this scene with some comments on the European immigrants who populated this region.
The Germans, upon their arrival in Pennsylvania, brought with them all their superstition and belief in witches. And in almost every bush, rock, or stump, they saw the witches playing their pranks, and occasionally mounting on the back of a poor white as he was returning homewards from a tavern in his neighborhood, and riding him until he reached his own cabin.
The oak tree around which our chanting witches supposedly danced was located on Hexenkopf Rock, that is, Witch's Head Rock, an actual site about 15 minutes outside the old steel town of Bethlehem. As you might expect, these gatherings were especially associated with May Eve, or Walpurgisnacht, as in Germany, and as described in our first two episodes of this show. All manner of local legends are attached to the site. Cars and buggies traveling up the road toward the hill are said to disappear en route. The ghost of a peg-legged farmer who died chasing a demon there can be heard clopping over the rock. It's haunted by ghosts of suicides who died on the site, as well as a headless man, a headless dog, and a white fox spirit first mentioned back in the 1700s. Stories are told of frequent fires on nearby property, failed crops, lightning strikes, telephone poles invariably falling, hunters' guns jamming, and don't count on your GPS anywhere nearby. One of the most commonly mentioned phenomena is an eerie glow said to be emitted by the Hexenkopf. The rock acquired its witchy associations thanks to Johann Peter Seiler, who immigrated from Germany in 1738. Making his home on land upon which the rock stood, Seiler gained a reputation as a folk healer, eventually attracting those seeking his services from as far away as Massachusetts and the Carolinas. His son Peter was the first of many Seilers to carry on this tradition, the last only dying out in 1905. And Peter, in particular, inspired a body of legend, often describing him in more witch-like terms. Stories, for instance, of Seiler trapping a thief within a magic circle, crafting a magic talisman that allowed him to win a shooting competition, and, strangely, tying knots in a thread with his tongue. Most importantly, Seiler's cures are said to be accomplished by drawing malevolent spirits out of his patients and imprisoning them in the nearby Hexenkopf. The particular form of magic we're discussing in this episode, practiced by German Americans of Pennsylvania ever since they immigrated here in the late 18th century, though now to a much, much smaller extent, is called Braucherei. The word means something like what is practiced, or the usage, or the custom. One who practices it is called a Braucher, or Braucherin for a woman, or Braukfrau, and even a Brauchdoktor, Dr. Braucherei, that is. This was the original word, but another that's perhaps a bit more popular, if confusing, is powwow. which can be practiced by a powwower or powwow doctor, or just a powwow sometimes they call it. The connection to the Native American term is definitely a matter of debate. Powwow was the word used by the local Algonquins for either a medicine man or his rituals, describing a shamanistic trance state, and literally translated as
he dreams.
It's been suggested that our Dr. Zeiler of the Hexenkopf, who offered his healing services to the settlers and the natives alike, was described by the latter as
the Great Powwow,
and that the term stuck. I'm not sure exactly what sort of records support that theory, but it's also been suggested that other settlers outside of the German tradition, that is, the English, dubbed the German customs powwow as a disparaging comparison to native rituals. In any case, the term stuck and is used without any such connotation today among the Pennsylvania Dutch themselves. And I should clarify a couple things about the Pennsylvania Dutch. The phrase comes from the English misuse of the word Dutch for Deutsch. In this case, the Germans, who immigrated mainly from Germany's southwestern Rhineland and settled in the Dutch country of southern Pennsylvania, as it's called. Brauerei traditions later dispersed from there throughout the state into Appalachia, Ohio, Indiana, and even the Ozarks. By the way, we're not really talking about the Amish here. They're among the Pennsylvania Dutch, but engaging with brauerei is highly discouraged, though it occasionally does happen in secret. The services of a braucher are sought out to cure or to prevent bodily or spiritual ills, bless undertakings, provide protection from various misfortunes, including thefts and legal troubles. Horses and livestock are also frequently treated by the braucher, who can be either male or female, gender balance that's ensured by the custom of the magical phrases and techniques only being passed on male to female or vice versa. It's common to be passed on through a family, but it needn't always be. A braucher might work at the craft full-time with a dedicated space, or may engage in a very limited practice, only sought out to treat warts, for instance. Like the cunning folk or the fixers of fattucchiera of southern Italy discussed several shows back, the braucher necessarily considers themselves a Christian, as items like the Bible and holy water are essential to their craft. Though they're sometimes called witches by outsiders, the braucher would never consider himself such. The tradition allows for no good witches, as you might find in Wicca, but there are certainly witches who practice what's known as hexerei, and the braucher is quite often sought out to help someone who's been verhexed by a hex or witch. However, it's not entirely uncommon for the line between the two to be obscured, or roles reversed, as in stories of a seemingly benign braucher who's later revealed to be a witch. While we're on the topic, I should address hex signs, those circular designs sometimes painted on Pennsylvania barns. The name itself was first used in a book promoting Pennsylvania tourism in the 1920s, and locals previously just referred to them as stars or flowers, and would usually describe them as merely decorative. But some of the designs are associated with or seem to have evolved from other magical figures carved or painted inside barns or homes, or in furniture such as cradles, for the purposes of protection. But the name remains misleading. Certainly no Dutchman would want anything tied to hexerei adorning his barn, even if the idea represented an intriguing tourist draw, which seems to be their main function today. A braucher may make use of traditional medicinal herbs, but is not the same as an herbalist. Most techniques they employ, at least those specific to the craft, would have a more magical aspect. Charms written on paper, sometimes called tickets, are especially prevalent and are carried in bags or fixed inside the house or barn. Red thread is used for a number of purposes, and anything red is considered powerful as a symbol of the blood's vitality or Christ's redeeming blood. Candles and sulfur are often burned. ordinary stones that have been blessed, or occasionally an unusual stone, one with a hole through its middle, or magnetic properties. These can be used as charms against rabies or lightning, for instance. It can also be passed over a patient to draw out illnesses or transfer the stone's blessing. The procedure would always be accompanied by certain prescribed words, blessings or invocations, spoken subvocally, that is, quietly mouthed, but virtually inaudible to the client. Most any work performed by the Braca would be accompanied by a particular verbal formula. A common relief for warts, for instance, would be to cut open a potato and rub its surface over the area to absorb the wart's vitality. And then the potato was buried so that as it rots, the wart will likewise diminish. Typically, this would be done under a waning moon to encourage the wart to likewise wane, and a lot of the magic is grounded in astrological observations. Illnesses can be extracted using, say, some material scraped from the patient's nails, which would be transferred into some sort of container, such as the hollow of a goose quill, and then this would be sealed in a hole in a tree, entrapping the illness, as Dr. Zeiler is said to have entrapped malignancies within the Hexenkopf. The wooden plugs hammered into seal such holes are found from time to time in older trees throughout the Dutch country. A particularly powerful charm that's common and also has moved westward into Appalachia and beyond is called the blood verse, a passage from the biblical book of Ezekiel recited to stop bleeding.
And when I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live.
Not only are such Bible verses employed in Braucherei, but the Christian Trinity is constantly invoked in three-part charms calling upon Father, Son, and Holy Ghost along the way. The Braucher will often punctuate his work with a sign of the cross and recite liturgical formulations, including Hail Marys. Saints are likewise invoked or carried on charms. St. Lawrence, who was martyred on a heated iron for burns, and the soldier saints George and Martin will be invoked against robbers, for instance. While all of this could seem surprisingly Catholic for immigrants from Germany's Protestant regions, it's typical folk magic, which serves as a sort of underground continuation of medieval practice in a post-Reformation world. Magic is often a conservative cultural receptacle like this. Just consider how it's preserved the four elements of Aristotelian science or astrological notions that were later replaced by modern astronomy. Now, a bit about that book mentioned in our opening, the classic source book for Braucherei. It was published in 1820 in Reading, Pennsylvania, by the German immigrant, printer, and Braucher John George Hohmann, or Johann Georg Hohmann, and is usually called, as you may remember, The Long-Lost Friend. This peculiar title was given its first English edition in 1846, and is what stuck, but the original German, literally translated, would be something like
The Long Hidden Treasure and House Friend.
That is a treasury of information serving the home as an encyclopedic companion. There were a number of books and periodicals published as companions in frontier times, something that would provide homesteaders a sort of connection to civilization and stand in for that wise old advice-giving neighbor one wouldn't have access to out in the frontier. Hohmann's book offered not only solutions for the health and well-being of the individual, but also protection for one's home, property, crops, and livestock. While all of this sounds well-meaning enough, Hohmann expressed doubts about it all in his foreword.
I had not wanted to allow it to be printed, and my wife also opposed it, but my compassion for my fellow man was too great.
We actually don't know that much about Hohmann himself, and less about his wife, but it seems possible she may also have been a Braucherin, and both were clearly well aware of traditional taboos of secrecy. And part of this certainly may have been the proprietary feelings of practitioners, but also the fear of being misunderstood or mocked by outsiders has also certainly played a role in this. Whatever criticism Holman exposed himself to, the book has served to widely disseminate and preserve the tradition, and has never been out of print for more than 2 centuries. In the 1930s, the Chicago publisher even issued a version illustrated by comic book artist Charles Quinlan, one featuring on its cover a fanciful rendering of Holman posed before Egyptian pyramids. Holman may have relied partially on personal experience and contact with other Brauchas and its oral transmissions, but previous to The Long-Lost Friend, other European magic books did continue to play a role in Braucherei, and bits of those ended up compiled into Holman's volume, some of them verbatim. A particularly notorious book, only rarely consulted by the Brauchas, but supposedly often used in Hexerei, is the 6th and 7th book of Moses. Its title being based on the suggestion that after writing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Moses wrote or inspired this apocryphal volume to reveal the secrets that allowed him to part the Red Sea and defeat Pharaoh's magicians, and all the knowledge that was eventually passed on to Solomon and then on down to the present day, and the book explains that history a bit too. Whatever the claims, the earliest edition of the volume can actually only be dated to about 1850. This book's sinister association with Hexerei is due to its inclusion of a number of destructive, even lethal rituals and spells. Traditional Dutch are actually very afraid of this book, and even having it in a home can bring terrible misfortune. It later acquired a similar reputation in American hoodoo, and to this day it's banned from import to Jamaica. Well, that's some background on Braucherei or powwow. I'd like to spend the rest of the show looking at some historic incidents, just a small sampling of the many that can be found in Pennsylvania history. We'll do more of this in the next show too. An early figure from the hills of southwestern Pennsylvania's Fayette County was Mary or Molly Derry, usually called Moll Derry or Old Moll. She arrived from Germany with her husband, a Hessian mercenary hired to fight the British, though he seems to have switched sides at some point. While some accounts hint that her husband's sharpshooting abilities were augmented by his own magic practices, it was Moll Derry who gained the enduring reputation as a healer, a finder of lost items, and fortune teller. An 1879 newspaper account written some 36 years after her death for the Placerville Mountain Democrat describes her prognostication accomplished through the reading of coffee grounds, noting that
it was thought by many that Moll had intimate dealings with the devil. As far as known, she harmed no one, and if she got her money and coffee, she was always contented.
But another story associated with her casts her in a bit more of a threatening light. Sometime in 1794, we're told 3 ne'er-do-wells were passing through town and encountered Moll and mocked her reputation as a teller of fortunes, inspiring her to offer a grim prophecy for the 3 of them. All of them would be hanged. And indeed they were. The first swings only a few months later for murdering a tavern keeper, the second a few years after that for killing a patron in an Ohio bar fight, and the third, learning of his friend's death in Ohio, throws the rope over a rafter and commits suicide in like manner, fulfilling Old Moll's prophecy, or perhaps curse. There are a few more legends that insert Old Moll into actual local history. In one, she's offering psychic insights regarding the famous lost children of the Alleghenies case. And in another, which involved a peddler murdered in the town of Smithfield, her apprentice kills the murderer by driving a nail into an image of him, very slowly, agonizingly so, over a period of time. She's also in the 1865 book, The White Rocks by A.F. Hill, a romanticized retelling of the case of Polly Williams, who in 1810 was believed to have been pushed to her death from the titular rock formation by a faithless lover. In the novel, Old Moll appears suddenly on the outcropping with suggestions of a dark fate awaiting Williams.
Her appearance as she stands there is miserable, squalid, and wretched, not to say frightful. She is about 5 feet high and very thin, almost a skeleton. Her apparel consists of nothing but rags from head to foot, miserable, colorless, dirty rags. The coarse black hair hangs in tangled masses from her head, which is entirely void of any artificial covering. Her cheeks are hollow and sunken, and her small black eyes are set so deep in her head that they glance out in such a disagreeable way that one feels as uneasy in front of them as though they were muzzles of loaded pistols.
Well, that's certainly suitably witchy. But elsewhere I see more surprising descriptions, suggesting that Old Moll was actually quite petite, small enough, in fact, that she slept in a cradle. I'm going to move over to Berks County, where there's a particularly rich vein of Braucherei and Hexerei. It was in the county seat of Reading, after all, that Homan's long-lost friend was published, and near the town of Hamburg, one finds the appropriately named Witchcraft Road, which runs alongside a Witch's Hill, a site with a reputation similar to the Hexenkopf, and sometimes also called Hexedanz, or Witch's Dancing Place, thanks to its legendary status as the site of Sabbath revels. Scanning newspaper archives for stories from Berks County, I found, for instance, an 1889 story from Boyerton told by an unnamed Philadelphia correspondent to a journalist for the Brooklyn Citizen. As the story begins, a man in Boyerton is being harassed by a witch who would
come to his house in the dead hour of the night, sometimes on a horse, and no one could see him but the man he was torturing. This man's daughter could see the window fly up when the witch comes into his room, and could see and hear the window fall when he went out, but could not see the witch himself. He would sit on this poor man's breast and hammer and pinch him dreadfully, and would keep him up nearly every night until he had him so sore that he could scarcely move around at all.
Sounds a bit sleep paralysis. Anyway, seeking relief, the victim visits what's presumably a helpful Brauche, but what the journalist calls
a witch doctor.
An elaborate and actually very typical ritual is prescribed, involving a charm written by the Brauche and a particular nail with which the client is to nail the charm to a tree at sunrise. The Brauche instructs him to administer one light tap daily. As the nail progresses into the tree, the attack should decrease in intensity and frequency. But the man grows impatient, and on the third day strikes the nail so hard it shoots in up to the head. At that instant,
he saw the form of his tormentor fall dead before him, and he went to the depot and told several parties that he had killed such and such a man in Reading that morning. They laughed at him and said he was crazy, but sure enough, the witch, who was walking in his garden in this city 10 miles away, as the doctor said he would do, and as the man said he had done, fell dead in his tracks at that time.
This is all in newspapers too, don't forget. Another one from an 1892 edition of the Pittsburgh Daily Headlight. The author, a native of Berks County, claims it was told of a neighbor's family where a particularly beautiful baby had recently been born. He describes a visit to the home by an old woman widely suspected of being a witch. She picks up the baby from its cradle and
hugged it and kissed it, all the time muttering in the unknown language the race of hexes is supposed to understand.
After the witch leaves,
the baby instantly began to cry as if in the most intense pain. It was discovered that its body had become covered from head to foot with angry spots as thick as those of a leopard.
The crying continues throughout the next days, and the child begins to lose weight, so help is sought through a number of brokers, including a particularly renowned one from Reading. Upon his arrival, he requests the family Bible, inscribes some magical words, and places it under the child's pillow.
He then sprinkled over the baby a powder which he had made by burning on a silver dish a bunch of pure white horsehair. After this, he warned the mother that first thing the next morning, the hex would come over to borrow a drawing of tea. She must emphatically refuse the favor, for if she succeeded in getting the tea or in borrowing a flat iron, her spell would still remain on the child.
This is common in Dutch stories, the witch needing something belonging to the individual upon which she can work her magic. The next day, the witch indeed visits and is denied, and the same for the second. But on the third night, when the family cat returns from its evening prowl and hops on the windowsill and scratches to come in,
the mother of the child went to let the cat in, but fell back amazed and frightened when her husband seized her by the arm and at the same time hurled his heavy cowhide boot through the window, knocking the cat with a yell to the ground. "That wasn't our cat," he exclaimed. "It was the old hex herself trying to get in." Next morning, the hex came around looking pale and haggard and limping badly. She said she had fallen down the stairs during the night.
but everyone knows the witch just got the boot. This motif is one folklorists have dubbed
The witch who was hurt.
And it's one going back to medieval tales of shape-shifting witches and turning into hares, and more recently maybe werewolves being injured and identified that way. The identification of the witch or magician puts an end to the secret attacks, as is the case in this story, a happy ending for everyone but the witch. I have another feline story, our last for the show, but it's a longer one as so much was written about the case at the time. I'm talking about the hex cat of Tumbling Run Valley. This takes place, by the way, in Schuylkill County, adjacent to Berks on the north, and begins toward the end of September of 1911, when a farmer by the name of Howell Thomas is told by a powwow doctor that his family is suffering under a witch's curse laid upon them by an unnamed relative in the neighboring town of Orwigsburg. Thomas is warned that the witch will make her particularly dangerous and final attack in the shape of a black cat. And sure enough, a black cat does turn up on the farm, and it's clearly no ordinary animal. The Newcastle Herald of September 30th quotes what the Thomases have to say about it.
It had the power to silence pistols, which were brought for protection, and cows had pined away and died. The family assert that they saw it grow to 4 feet in height and then resume its natural size. They are afraid of it and are afraid to kill it.
But the cat has no qualms about killing, it seems. In that same article, it's reported that Howell Thomas, the 61-year-old family patriarch, has died, and that daughter Mary Isabella is blaming the sinister cat, which continues to menace those on the farm. Next, we hear that some unidentified powwow doctor has suggested that the animal might be killed with a special bullet. The Pottsville Republican and Herald continues our story.
They waited with a gun loaded with a gold bullet, but the feline, for the first time in many weeks, failed to put in an appearance. Some of the waiting guests believed the evil spirit was frightened away by the fact that they carried Bibles, crucifixes, and talismans to break witches' spells.
And it's not just the Thomas farm that's under the cat's evil influence. The whole area now seems verhexed, as they say.
The authorities were surprised at the number of weird complaints which came in from that vicinity. One farmer, who had brought a large quantity of milk from the Tumbling Run Valley for many years, declares that the fresh fluid was discolored as he brought it to market. There were also 3 automobile accidents in that vicinity.
By the first week of October, the story is circulating beyond Pennsylvania, appearing in papers all the way down to Florida. The tale's next installment, syndicated by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, announces a sort of victory.
Captured by a Bible thrown at it, the only witch cat the hex believers of Schuylkill County known to be in captivity has been exhibited in a show window here behind 8-inch steel bars, where hex doctors are anxiously studying the creature to determine whether it is the animal which Miss Mary Thomas blames for the death of her father, and a long train of other misfortunes in the Thomas family.
And in another account, I see it reported that
Thousands
had come by to view the hex cat on display. The Post-Gazette goes on to describe exactly how a man by the name of Charles Lawson went about pursuing the witchy cat.
Lawless provided himself with an old blunderbuss, said to have been blessed by a saint, a net made of the intestines of a pure white lamb, a book of magic against witches' spells, and many other talismans, and was rewarded for his labors by the appearance of a black cat. Too much excited to use his gun, Thomas threw a Bible at the cat, whereupon it walked over to Lawless, spit in his face, and clawed him. Lawless got a good grip on Pussy, however, and brought her to town, though Miss Thomas wasn't sure that it was the witch cat.
This particular installment of the story ends with comments about hex doctors suggesting spells to help detain the cat until such time as they can come by in person to ascertain by whatever magical means if this is indeed the supernatural cat in question. However, by October 14th, the Newcastle Herald reports,
"The cat was carefully guarded, but disappeared today. 2 of the slats of the cage had been removed, but who did this has not been discovered. Many are of the belief that the hex or evil spirit had something to do with letting the cat, despite the many mystic and scriptural charms, get away."
the presumption seems to have been that the hex cat would return to the Thomas farm to finish what it started, as a few days later the Intelligencer Journal from Lancaster, Pennsylvania is reporting on supernatural efforts to defend the farm, and this one I find syndicated in newspapers all the way to Hawaii. Anyway, powwowers gathered at the Thomas farm decide on a fire with fire approach to the problem, declaring that the hex cat,
"It can only be dispelled by installing a certain black cat, now owned by a Schuylkill Haven man. This feline has never eaten anything but toads, frogs, lizards, and serpents, and hex doctors agreed that its presence will restore the Thomas homestead to a normal condition." The cat is said to have been born on the 6th day of the 6th month of 1906, and to have it been one of a litter of 6 kittens. It was blind only 6 days after being born, whereas all ordinary cats are blind 9 days. The hex doctors declare that these facts make this a hexanemeron cat. The word hexanemeron is taken from 2 Greek words, hex, 6, and hemera, days, and is usually employed to the 6 days of creation, as described in the first chapter of Genesis. Where there are only 5 books of Moses in the Authorized Bible, the hex doctors believe they have a 6th book of Moses.
if you're finding this all confusing, it's not you. There's a bit more to the article, but all I can make of it is that there's some connection to the especially powerful 6th and 7th book of Moses, which we discussed. We don't hear any more about this cat actually being brought to the farm, but apparently just the presence of a bunch of powwowers powwowing together appears to have relieved certain supernatural effects the hex cat had produced.
The hundreds of visitors to the bewitched place Friday afternoon found that the hens were no longer crowing like roosters, nor were the pigs barking like dogs.
And there don't seem to be any further stories about a capture of the Hex Cat, but there was a further fallout, and not all of it bad. The Pottsville Republican and Herald reported regarding Mary Isabella, who had been at the center of many of the stories.
Since she made public her statement that a hex is following the family, she has had 5 offers of marriage. She has decided to accept none of them.
And citizens of the town of Pottsville, being a bit more cosmopolitan, at least on a sliding scale, more so than those in the country around the Thomas farm, to some extent they regarded the whole thing as a lark. Again, from the Republican and Herald.
On Monday night, the Amphion Social Club of this place proposes holding a hex cat dance. The committee will decorate the hall in the most uncanny manner possible, while the Black Thomas cats will be placed in the cozy corners.
Halloween was approaching, after all, so the timing was good. Another article anticipates the craze lasting all the way to Christmas.
Pottsville is certainly in the midst of a reign of hex popularity, which is not by any means confined to the county or even the state. Hex cats have jumped into such popularity that they threaten to become a rival of the teddy bear and the Billy Possums. Stores in town are now selling woolly hex cats, and they are going like hotcakes. And it will be an unfortunate child who is not remembered by Santa Claus Christmas morning with a genuine hex cat.
On November 1st, over in York, Pennsylvania, the Dispatch reported,
Last night, being Halloween, the town went wild over witches and hex cats. There were many public street demonstrations, and the witch and hex cat emblems and miniatures were everywhere displayed.
By the way, just coincidentally, the headline I noticed running right under that story happens to offer a bit more countrified amusement. It read,
Cows soused on hard cider. 17 bovines on spree after eating rotten apples.
So much merriment around York that autumn. I guess rotten apples don't spoil every bunch. Anyway, that's all for this episode, but we'll have even more seriously witchy mischief from old Pennsylvania, some not so serious, coming in our next show.
Black cat, black cat, black cats all around me. Black cat.
I hope everyone's been enjoying our show and that you might have the opportunity to share episodes with friends, or even better, leave a review wherever you listen. You don't even have to write anything. You just leave those star ratings, all of the stars. As I mentioned at the top of the show, these episodes only keep coming out because of the support of our Patreon subscribers. When you donate, you're helping to pay for the more than 100 hours I end up putting into each show. Pledge commitments begin at $1 and can be edited at any time. Those subscribing at the $4 level or higher now receive a short extra episode in the Marvelous and Rare format. You can hear some samples of that if you look in the archives. We also have the Bone and Sickle candle, as well as 2 different mystery kits. Each one's unique. And we still offer my Krampus book and the show soundscapes you hear in the background. I'd like to welcome those generous souls who pledged their support recently. Thank yous to John Deere, Jody, Boudica Artemisia, and to Christopher Chambers and Corianne Wilson for upping their pledges. Also, we had some audio cameos by some of our patrons on this show. The Hexenkopf Witch Chant featured the voices of Alison Lovecraft, Victoria Howard, Angelica, Bridget Case, Jenny Matisiak, Molly Van Overhill, Alice Price, and Anne Lubin. Bone and Sickle is written and produced by me, Al Ridenour. Mrs. Carswell is played by Sarah Chavez, whose projects and writing related to death and culture you can track at sarah-chavez.com. Thanks so much for listening.